very warm welcome to our Climate Challenge Conference. It's very, very good to have some friends here from the Collective de Climato-Realists, that's it, yes. And forgive our English, we will do our best. I have on my screen, coincidentally, a bridge that was built in the 19th century in Britain by a man who was half English and half French, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. His father, Marc Brunel, was a Frenchman, and so that's very appropriate, I think, for our meeting. Now, first of all, some nuts and bolts and so forth. This book is available for free. If you want to take a number of copies for other people, please do that. So these are for free. We also have a tie, which some of us are wearing already. I've given it to some folks who it's their only payment, no, that's not quite true, but for coming if they're speaking. But if you're prepared to contribute towards it, I think I'm charging as much as €20 for it, or £15 if you work in English money. And if you work in Canadian or American dollars, oh well, forget it. We can work something out. There are books available too. I've got a few copies of Andrew Montford's account of the email leak, hiding the decline, the Climate Gate affair. James Denningpole, sitting at the back there, invented the name Climate Gate as a journalist, so it's good to have him with us. What I do not have, I only have a sample copy because I think you guys in France will be able to get it, and anyway it's in French, which I struggle, it's good stuff though to do that. Philippe Verdier, the weather forecaster, who of course lost his job for daring to publish that. As always, as one of the organisers, nothing like trying to flog your own stuff, I wrote a book about the whole wide issue of climate change, partly from my Christian perspective, and trying to talk to my fellow Christians on the issue. The title is While the Earth Endures, Creation, Cosmology and Climate Change. There are copies of that at the back, and I'll part you with some money if you want to buy them. You're that foolish. I also have a summary of Professor Murray Salby's lectures, his first set of lectures in 2013. I'll briefly touch on some of his material in my talk. We may have time to watch his full second lecture, which he did earlier this year, on the issue of where the CO2 is coming from, what it's doing, and where it's going, I suppose is the right way to put it. But there are copies of that at the back as well. There's also a copy of a little amusing story I wrote called A Climate Carol. I couldn't help, there was some loony at NASA who apparently as a hobby ghostbusted. Yes. But they put me in mind of Dickens and the ghost of Christmas past, Christmas present, Christmas yet to come. And I thought, yeah, the ghost of climate past, climate present and climate yet to come, based around poor George Monbiot of The Guardian, though I do not name him for libel reasons, who acts as the Scrooge of my tiny tale. Now, the timetable is the one in red, white, and blue, or blue, white, and red, should I say, which supersedes what's actually printed in the book. When we went to press, we just had to go with what we had. So if there should be if you haven't got it, that's what it looks like. So that's that. Well, I think it's all right with you guys. With no further ado, I'll briefly introduce myself, Foster. My background is that I'm actually a retired Anglican church minister, and started my interest in this whole climate issue because the churches got terribly excited about it. And this was about 12, 15 years ago. I read Bjorn Lomborg's book, Skeptical Environmentalist, which I presume some of you folks have read, which was an eye-opener. And I took it from there, really. My background, despite being a church minister, is in science. I have a degree in natural science from the University of Cambridge, and some years ago I taught science in Nigeria for 6 years, up to what I think would now be regarded as first-year university level, so that's about where I'm at. I tend to do my talks in what I call a magpie fashion. I collect ideas. They're not, very seldom are they my own, but I try and pull them together and hopefully make it comprehensible to the ordinary man. Probably to most of you will think, oh, don't oversimplify it, but there will be a bit. Okay, let's get going on this. And somebody maybe better show. Oh, I better introduce Tom Harris while he's here.
Yeah, while he's
he is one of the co-organisers. He's working like mad. And Roger, who is, you can't miss him, because when he stands up, he's kind of handy to have in a crowd, because you know where he is. He's a co-organiser, to put it mildly, set up a website, done a whole raft of stuff. So I'd like to, anyway, thank them very much for being Proceed on. We've got 3 days, so here we go. I don't want to start. Right, let's start here. I like to begin with a good Christian verse. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. And just in passing, one of the things in Genesis that God did not give man dominion over was the weather. Just a thought to leave it with you. There seems to be a belief that there is a perfect climate out there somewhere, just like in Camelot. Those of you who remember that English musical, we were told that everything did exactly according to plan. Of course, that is not the way. Going backwards in time, we have a philosophical pressure that is built up to where we are today. Others will know more about this than I, but I'm just sort of spading up one or two. Well, one in particular. The Reverend, I'm sorry to say, Thomas Malthus, whom, if you remember, did a mathematical calculation to say that if the population of the planet reached 400 million, we would all starve to death and die of disease. I'm happy to say he was wrong. Other people have been right, but been ignored. Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis, who, anybody can quickly volunteer what he is known for? Puerperal fever. In the 19th century, mothers being taken into hospital to have children were dying like flies because the medical students would come from the path labs and simply examine the women. Their hands were filthy, and before long, whole wards were being wiped out. Semmelweis spotted this, insisted that his students wash their hands before they examined their patients, and the death rates plummeted. No one believed him. They all said, we're not doing this. This is nonsense, all this hand washing. And he was sacked from this hospital. Why is that familiar? He moved to another hospital, tried to reintroduce the same ideas and the same consequences. The death rates plummeted. Again, we don't believe you. And they sacked him. And the tragedy is that he ended his life in a lunatic asylum, where he had been so obsessed with the deaths that it just drove him crazy. Another man on the other side of this, Trofim Lysenko, probably I need to say very little about him, but he persuaded Stalin that he understood Mendelian genetics, or rather dismissed Mendelian genetics. He knew how to make crops withstand Siberian temperatures. Millions died, and astonishingly, he died a natural death, as far as I can work out, in 1976. Another man, Alfred Wegener, I'm sure you guys know about this, plate tectonics. In the 1930s, he put forward the theory that the Earth is moving. Most people said, it's rubbish. I don't think he was sacked, didn't get that bad. But here's a classic case of someone standing out saying this is the way it is, and it turned out to be correct. I mentioned Paul Ehrlich. He was the one, incidentally, who the economist Julian Simon took a bet with about resources in the I think it was the 1980s. On a 10-year basis, he said you can choose any 5 commodities you like, and I bet you, I think it was $10,000, or there was some. It was a reasonable bet, and with people like Paul Ehrlich, that in 10 years' time they will actually, in real terms, be cheaper because there will be more of these resources, or at least enough of them. They thought money for old rope. Took on the bet and lost. And it was through that Lomborg, who read that story and thought, surely that isn't right, began to investigate the state of the planet materially and realized that on the whole, Julian Simon was correct. However, our beloved Paul Ehrlich, it's not very kind to bring up past remarks, as many politicians know, but I cannot but help saying that false prophets abound in this area. Paul Ehrlich in 1981 prophesied that by the year 2000, half the species on the earth would be extinct, and by 2015, all life would be extinct. Sorry guys, we're dead. This is what the Bible defines as a false prophet. And there's a wonderful Old Testament scripture in Deuteronomy. You may say to yourselves, how can we know when a message has not been spoken by the Lord? If what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord, now granted Ehrlich didn't do that, but he did do it with great authority, does not take place or come true, that message the Lord has not spoken, that prophet has spoken presumptuously, do not be afraid of him. Very good advice, or to summarize it, one strike and you're out. A more sane scientist, and I think well worth writing over everything we do as much as any scientist does, no amount of experimentation can prove me right, a single experiment can prove me wrong. And that is how science should proceed. I'm moving on to what I call some climate myths, which when you come down to it, people will tell you is the case, but actually when you press them, there's no real evidence to support it. A case in point is the belief that were the Earth to be warming, more extreme weather events will start taking place. This is the standard rhetoric one hears. And I base this very simply on Professor Richard Lenzon's very straightforward point on this. If we simplify the situation considerably, which I'm doing, from, as it were, the north to the equator, and the same to some degree is true of the south, of course. If the cause of extreme weather is the clash, essentially, between the cold north and the warm tropics, that generates the excitement in the middle. Now, if the Earth warms, what actually happens is that it's the poles that become much warmer, whereas the tropics perhaps rise by half a degree or a degree, perhaps become wetter. These things are all a bit chaotic. But the general point is that the temperature gradient has reduced. And as a natural consequence of that reduction, not surprisingly, you will have less rather than more extreme weather in warmer conditions. It's colder extreme weather that produces extreme conditions. The British know a little bit about this, the English that is. In 1588, the beloved Spanish decided the Armada would be a good move to invade Britain. And although Mr. Francis Drake, that pirate, privateer, that solid soldier, did some damage to the Armada, the main thing that damaged it was the incredible August storms that broke out across both the Atlantic and, of course, in the North Sea, which drove the Armada. It was driven right round the north of Scotland, and the shredded remains of that limped back to Spain. And a medal was issued by Elizabeth, and it's got the wonderful motto on it, God blew with his wind, and they were scattered. Now, this was in the middle of the Little Ice Age, and these are these extreme August storms. It's just anecdotal rather than, if you like, statistical, but it's a classic instance of extreme weather created primarily by cold, not heat. Another quotation from that period, John King, an Elizabethan preacher, our years are turned upside down, our summers are no summers, our harvests are no harvests. This is in the depths, of course, of the Little Ice Age that Michael Mann thought didn't exist. Well, we can, to some degree, test the idea that if it's getting warmer, that we should have more storms. Well, in fact, here's tornadoes, and one can pull on all number of statistics here. Really, there is no pattern. There are spikes, there are troughs. It's complicated and certainly not related
Notable,
to
Philip, that the spike there is in the cold year, the La Nina year, 2008.
Yeah. Here again is general storm energy, both globally and in the Northern Hemisphere. Again, the pattern, there is no pattern, is the point. There is no relation to global temperatures. Polar bears, another great scare story, as we all know. Well, I think the polar bears are doing fine. If you want to know more details, Dr. Susan Crockford is one of, but not the only person who's very interesting on this topic. One of the problems polar bears suffer from, no, that isn't one of their problems, that's what they like to eat, ringed seals. One of the problems those polar bears suffer from is too much cold. If the ice in the Arctic becomes too thick, there becomes a problem for these ringed seals. Ringed seals put their little seal cubs on top of the ice and put a little igloo over them to protect them, and then they burrow up from underneath to feed them. Very neat idea. So they all happen in disguise. The trouble happens when the ice they have to burrow through gets too thick. The seals therefore can't survive, or they move to where it's thinner. The polar bears who are relying on the seals start to starve. So when it gets too cold, very often polar bears start to struggle, which is an interesting upside down turning again. The myth is that it's the other way around. Patrick is going to talk a lot more about this, so I'm just throwing this in as a sort of stone into the water. The oceans, this ocean acidification idea. First of all, I quote, here's my magpie mind, Professor Ian Plimer, who makes the lovely comment, the oceans can only become acidic if the Earth runs out of rocks. Basically, the oceans are a buffered solution, and if you're a chemist, you'll understand what that means. In crude terms, those of you who remember your experiments in school days of testing for CO2, you used lime water. Do you remember? It's calcium hydroxide solution. And you bubbled CO2 through lime water. And what happened? It went cloudy, milky, as it formed calcium carbonate, which is insoluble. But your teacher would then go on and bubble more CO2 through that solution, and the solution would go clear again, because the extra CO2 turned the calcium carbonate into soluble calcium hydrogen carbonate or bicarbonate. Now that's basically what goes on in the oceans all the time. The more CO2 that goes in, the more the limestone and so forth will tend to dissolve to form a basic solution of calcium hydrogen carbonate. So in other words, it's an ongoing buffer. Less or more, this evens it out. So if the Earth did run out of rocks, yeah, sure, you'd have a problem. Then, of course, there's the pause, or not the pause, depending on our English Met Office. Dame Julia Slingo has told us, oh, we just had a 1 degree rise in temperature, and it's all dreadful, and we're doomed, and it's the hottest year ever, and all the rest of it. She also said, oh, we haven't had the sea level rise that we're bound to expect as a result of this, so watch out. It's suddenly going to happen. I love it. When the models say that there's supposed to be so much sea level rise, and it doesn't happen, the models are right, and reality is wrong. Puts me in mind of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Never mind. Then there's the issue of the weather stations, temperature stations themselves. Now, Anthony Watts did a survey some years ago of where a lot of the stations that are used are actually located, and made some very interesting results. Here's an instance of one in an airfield, which of course is a logical place anyway to have a weather thing, you need it. But look where it is. It's in the slipstream of taxiing jets. So from time to time, obviously, the temperature is going to rise way above the normal, so you tend to get elevated temperatures. Here's another one, which he came across way out in the Californian hills. There's the Stevenson screen. However, here is a great flat strip of tarmac. And in hot weather, most of us know, tarmac gets extremely warm. And you can imagine, therefore, the thermometer a few feet above the ground is going to be well overheated just because of the presence of that tarmac. And he found that, I think, in something like 40% of the instruments that were inappropriately located. And also, one of the things that the people who do these temperatures did was to cull the number of stations they used for convenience. This is the sort of average number of stations that were being used. And it's intriguing, though don't read too much into it, correlation is not causation, that when they culled them by a considerable degree in the early 1990s, strangely the temperatures started to shoot up. Well, it's not necessarily that the two are connected, but just worth pausing. One point to make, I think, that all ground-based temperature averages, which is what they are still effectively proxies for temperature. For the simple reason that, of course, the thermometers are not spread evenly over the planet. and therefore an awful lot of interpolation goes on. The results are homogenized, and then you throw away the original, which means guesswork. So in other words, we're still only looking at a proxy, whereas insofar as we can have a proper temperature, it's only fair to say the satellite data is probably far more reliable as to what is going on most of the times. Bob Carter will recognise this, slightly masticated version of something he produced. Well, I say he produced, but he put in an article some years ago. Basically, in the last 6 million years, temperatures in a sense have been going down. There's been a slight warm rising to now, but basically we are cooling as a planet. I wasn't around 6 million years ago, but it was a little warmer then, apparently. Here is the last sort of 10,000 years, one of the versions of the ice core proxies, showing the Holocene warming with its spikes down as well. And here we are. And we are supposed to be worried. This is what sort of gets you. When you start looking at real history, you think, hang on, why are we worried? Well, here is the comparison between Hubert Lamb's sketch of the temperature for the last 1,000 years, the medieval warm period, the Little Ice Age, and currently roughly where we are. Once again, the question is, if that's reality, why are we worried? Well, of course, Michael Mann produced a very convenient excuse for that, saying, well, actually, this is what it is, and now it's all shooting up. So we should be worried. My problem is partly a question of, well, we know, I won't go into too much either about Mr. Mann, but in a sense, his science, so-called, compared to Professor Hubert Lamb, who was a man of considerable skill and talent, he's dead now, sadly. He was a man who knew his stuff, whereas Michael Mann was very much a new boy on the block,